When I was 12, I spent a lot of time at my friend Mark's house. He lived in an old, creaky house on the edge of town. Mark always told me stories about how the house was haunted, but I never believed him. He'd spin tales about shadows moving on their own, whispers in the night, and strange cold spots that seemed to follow you around. I always laughed it off, convinced that it was just his way of making the old house more exciting. One night though, I experienced something that changed my mind forever. It was a stormy night, and the wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. Rain lashed against the glass, and thunder rumbled in the distance. We were in Mark's room playing video games, trying to ignore the eerie sounds outside, when suddenly the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the only light came from occasional flashes of lightning that lit up the room in stark, fleeting bursts. We decided to explore the house with a flashlight, searching for candles or a lantern. Mark's parents were out of town for the weekend, so it was just the two of us. As we walked down the narrow hallway, the wood groaned under our feet, making it feel like the house itself was alive and watching us. Then, we heard a faint whispering sound. At first I thought it was just the wind sneaking through the old walls, but Mark looked at me with wide eyes and whispered, "Do you hear that?" We followed the sound to the basement door. My parents always told me never to go down there at night, he said, but curiosity got the better of us, and we descended the old wooden stairs. The basement was cold and filled with old furniture. The whispering grew louder, but we couldn't see anyone. Suddenly the flashlight flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness again. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel Mark's fear radiating off him. Then we heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Mark fumbled to turn the flashlight back on, his hands shaking. When he did, we saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was an old woman, her face twisted in a sinister grin. Her eyes glowed in the dim light, and her mouth moved, as if she was saying something we couldn't hear. She began to move towards us, her feet not quite touching the ground. We screamed and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. We leaned against the door, our hearts racing. We could still hear the faint whispering through the door, but it seemed to be fading. We never spoke of that night again, and I never went back to Mark's house. Years later, I learned that an old woman had died in that house many years before. People said she was a recluse who practiced dark magic. They said she had been shunned by the townspeople and had cursed anyone who set foot in her home. Some say her spirit still haunts the basement, waiting for unsuspecting children to wander too close. As I grew older, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I did some research and discovered that the old woman's name was Agatha Blackwood. She had been accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s and had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said she had summoned something dark and evil, something that still lingered in the shadows of her old house. One day, years after that fateful night, I decided to visit the old house again. Mark had moved away, and the house had been abandoned for years. It stood on the edge of town, forgotten and decaying. As I approached the house, I felt a sense of dread wash over me, but I pushed it aside. I had to know the truth. I entered the house, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. I made my way to the basement door, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door and descending down the stairs. The basement was just as I remembered it, cold and filled with old forgotten things. As I walked deeper into the basement, I heard the whispering again. It grew louder and louder until it was almost deafening. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the room. In the corner where we had seen the old woman years ago, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a circle of candles, long since burned out, and strange symbols drawn on the floor in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the circle, there was an old book. I approached it cautiously and picked it up. The book was filled with strange symbols and incantations. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and there she was, Agatha Blackwood, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. She smiled that sinister grin, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I dropped the book and ran up the stairs, not daring to look back. As I reached the top of the stairs, I slammed the door shut and ran out of the house. I could still hear her whispering in my ears as I fled. I never went back to that house again. To this day, I still hear her whispers in my nightmares. And I know that the spirit of Agatha Blackwood still haunts that old house, waiting for her next victim. Years went by, and the memory of that night never faded. I found myself obsessed with uncovering more about Agatha Blackwood and the history of the house. I visited local libraries, searched through old newspaper archives, and talked to elderly townsfolk who might remember the stories passed down through generations. One particularly stormy night, I sat in a dimly lit library, reading an old journal that had belonged to Agatha herself. It was filled with cryptic writings and disturbing sketches. One entry caught my eye. It detailed a ritual that Agatha had performed to bind her spirit to the house. The ritual required the blood of an innocent and the recitation of a dark incantation under the light of a full moon. My heart raced as I realized that the whispers we had heard in the basement were part of this incantation. Agatha had not been merely haunting the house. She had been trying to complete her ritual and gain eternal power. I knew I had to find a way to stop her, to break the curse that bound her spirit to the house. I reached out to Mark, who now lived in another state, and told him everything I had discovered. He was reluctant at first, but eventually, he agreed to help me. We planned to return to the old house on the night of the next full moon, armed with everything we needed to perform a counter ritual. The night of the full moon arrived, and we stood outside the house. The house seemed to loom over us, its windows like dark, empty eyes. We entered, and the familiar creaks and groans of the old floorboards greeted us. We made our way to the basement, where the air was thick with tension. We set up a circle of protection using salt and candles, and I began to read the counter ritual aloud. As I spoke the words, the temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers grew louder. The shadows seemed to move and twist, and I could feel Agatha's presence growing stronger. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. A cold, malevolent force slammed into our protective circle, trying to break through. I continued to recite the counter ritual, my voice shaking but determined. Mark held the flashlight steady, illuminating the ancient symbols on the floor. With a final desperate push, I shouted the last words of the counter ritual. There was a blinding flash of light, and the force pressing against our circle vanished. The basement was silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. We had done it. We had broken the curse and banished Agatha's spirit. As we left the house, I felt a sense of relief and closure. The old house still stood, but its malevolent presence was gone. Mark and I vowed never to speak of that night again, and we went our separate ways, our friendship forever changed by the experience. Years later, I sometimes find myself wondering if Agatha's spirit truly was banished or if she still lingers somewhere, waiting for another chance to complete her dark ritual. The old house eventually fell into ruin, but the memory of those events still haunts me. Every now and then, when the wind howls and the night is especially dark, I think I can still hear the faint whispering of Agatha Blackwood. Despite the years that passed, the nightmares never left me. I would often wake in a cold sweat, haunted by Agatha's sinister grin burned into my memory.